I believe in it, I answer for it, for the whole work of man really seems to consist in nothing but proving to himself every minute that he is a man and not a piano key. This line, spoken by the narrator in Dostoevsky's novel Notes from the Underground, captures the heart of the answer to the very first question that is likely to arise in the mind of anyone who comes across the topic of free will. Why should the question of free will matter to me? While at first glance, it may seem like such things belong to the domain of pointless abstractions, best left to philosophers who love to spend their lives debating imaginary problems, in this video, I will aim to show you why the question of whether we actually have free will is that which determines not just the motivation to act, but even to exist at all. I will also make my best attempt to give you an answer to that question, in the hopes that it helps you live your life just a little bit better. It is best to begin our exploration from the point of view which is most characteristic of the times that we live in, and which also happens to be a direct consequence of the modern rationalistic and scientific attitude. This is the perspective of materialism and its stubborn brainchild, hard determinism. The best contemporary voice for this perspective, and the poster boy for all arguments against the existence of free will, is Robert Sapolsky, the Stanford neuroscientist whose decades of research on behavior, stress, and the brain have made him the most prominent scientific advocate of hard determinism. Sapolsky's main idea is that everything that drives human behavior, including our wants, fears, impulses, and most importantly decisions, arise entirely from prior physical causes which are acting on our brain. In classical physics, such an idea would often be described through the image of a clockwork universe, a universe in which every single particle obeys fixed laws and therefore every single event is fully determined by that which came before. Sapolsky, of course, is careful not to endorse such a mechanistic picture in its literal form, and in keeping with the times, he acknowledges that modern physics involves probabilistic events rather than perfectly predictable ones. And yet, he insists that such a distinction makes no real difference for the question of free will, because whether events unfold by a causal chain or by randomness, neither mechanism grants us the kind of authorship over our actions that free will requires. In his view, both the feeling of choosing freely and our sense of autonomy are illusions. They are the mind's retrospective attempt to make sense of mechanisms whose sheer complexity lie far beyond our ability to grasp. For the sake of simplicity, we can derive three main assumptions that underlie the logic of his thinking. The first is an ontological assumption, that matter is primary and that there is nothing more fundamental than it, underlying reality. The second is a psychological assumption, that the subjective experience of being a self is an illusion, generated by neural and biological processes which themselves obey the laws of physical matter. And the third is a conclusion from these assumptions, that since everything that happens is a result of prior physical causes, that which we call choice is also an illusion. All our decisions are predetermined by insentient nature. All these assumptions are perfectly reasonable within the ontological framework in which Sapolsky operates. This framework corresponds to what the Vedic tradition calls Prakṛti in its lower conditioned modes, which are the aspect of nature that operates through mechanical causation. The fundamental problem with his worldview is not that it is mistaken, but rather that it is incomplete, because while it accurately describes one stratum of reality, it remains completely blind to the deeper dimensions of consciousness. With this, we arrive at the inevitable consequence of hard determinism, which is that a perspective limited to such a mechanical level of existence will always lead to a sense of psychological defeat for consciousness. Pessimism, weary resignation, and full-blown nihilism are the only logical outcomes in a world where nothing we do matters, no inner transformation is possible, and all personal growth is illusory because everything has already been decided. Such feelings are not simply an emotional reaction. They are the existential consequence of a worldview which denies agency at its very root. Innately, we sense that this cannot be the condition of our being or the final statement on that matter. And so, we can begin our real analysis of the problem of free will and start to see exactly where it is that hard determinism goes wrong. Now, the very first step to analyzing this is to understand a very fundamental problem, which is that truths in the domain of consciousness are not the same as scientific truths. You see, scientific truths are established by measurement, prediction, falsifiability, and observation. Truths of consciousness, by contrast, can only be judged by their integrative, transformative, and existential effects upon our inner being. This is because consciousness is accessible only through lived subjective experience. We cannot stand outside it as we can in the physical sciences. For this reason, the truths of consciousness must be judged by the effects they have upon our inner being. To understand how truth and free will works in consciousness, we will turn to three people who, in my opinion, are the most profound investigators of the structure and dynamics of the inner life. Although they come from different backgrounds, cultures, and periods of time, they are united by their deep insights into the fundamental nature of our being. The first is Carl Jung, arguably the greatest explorer of the human psyche in the modern West, and who spent decades studying dreams, symbolism, religion, myth, and the deep structure of consciousness. The second is Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, one of the most advanced yogis and spiritual philosophers of the last century, who developed an integral psychology that unites ancient Vedanta with modern psychological insight. And the last is the revered Indian sage Vyasa, one of the central authorities on the laws governing consciousness in the Indian tradition. All three great thinkers examined consciousness from within with exceptional depth and clarity, and so, through their points of convergence in understanding, we can establish the following epistemic principles of truth in inner life. Principle 1. Truth is experiential and known through inner transformation. The first and most fundamental principle is that truths of consciousness cannot be grasped by intellectual analysis alone. They must be lived, experienced, and realized from within. Jung makes this very clear in his writings. For him, psychological truths are never complete when they remain mere insights or ideas. They must be endured, acted upon, and allowed to reshape the personality from within. Therefore, when he says, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, he is describing a fundamental requirement of our nature, that the truth in the inner realm is inseparable from inner transformation. The very same truth is expressed by Vyasa in the Bhagavad Gita when he writes, "For one who has conquered the mind is the best of friends. But for one who has failed to do so, his mind will remain his greatest enemy." Here, mastery is not a matter of intellectual assent, but an inner conquest through which consciousness can become capable of reflecting the deeper truth of its own nature. Similarly, Sri Aurobindo, in his writings, tells us that the truth of being reveals itself only as one grows inwardly and purifies the instruments of consciousness. Thus, all three thinkers affirm the same understanding, that the truth is not an abstract proposition, but rather an inward realization that shapes the knower. Principle 2. Truth is existentially functional. While the first principle speaks to the experiential effects of truth, the second one speaks to its existential effects. Jung writes that the truth is that which helps us live properly. What he means by this is that true perception helps us by increasing our sense of vitality, integrity, and inward steadiness. False perceptions, in contrast, are those which fragment our psyche and diminish both our will and ability to act. Jung's clinical work made this fact unmistakably clear to him. He saw that when a person aligned themselves with the truth of life, even if that truth was difficult, the psyche responded with a kind of inward support, a strengthening of vitality, a clarification of purpose, and a quiet sense of being able to stand upright in existence. But when an individual tried to deny or escape a truth with moral or existential weight, the personality gradually destabilized. He understood that the psyche cannot carry falsehood without consequence, for it resists what is untrue, just as the body resists what is harmful. Therefore, truth proves existentially functional not because it is pleasant, but because it is the only ground upon which a human life can remain inwardly intact. Principle 3. Truth increases coherence, order, and intelligibility. The essence of this principle is best captured by a metaphor from the Gita, which says, "Even as all clouds are scattered by the mighty wind, so are the clouds of ignorance scattered by the sword of self-knowledge." This image beautifully illustrates how truth has the power to dispel the obscurity that conceals the structure of our inner life. A true idea illuminates the inner world rather than darkens it. It brings order where previously there was disorder and comprehension where there was confusion. Jung saw repeatedly that when an individual encountered a truth belonging to the deeper layers of the psyche, elements of the personality that once stood apart began to fall into meaningful relation, and the person achieved a clearer sense of inward direction. Falsehood, by contrast, scattered the energies of the psyche, generating contradiction and leaving one's life governed by forces that operate outside conscious understanding. Sri Aurobindo speaks of the same insight in the Synthesis of Yoga, where he writes that the descent of higher consciousness brings a luminous clarity, a harmony, a stability, a strength which enables one to face life and its problems with a sure power and immutable joy. Here again, truth is portrayed as a light that orders the inner being, making life more intelligible and less subject to obscurity and conflict. Principle 4. Truth aligns consciousness with what endures. Finally, truth in the inner domain must be recognized by its stability and by its power to endure. The sage Vyasa captures this through the distinction between Sat and Asat, the real which persists and the unreal which dissolves. The Gita expresses this with striking clarity. The unreal has no being and the real never ceases to be. In the realm of consciousness, this means that true perception roots us in what is lasting and self-consistent, while false perception binds us to what is already passing away. Jung realized a similar fact about the psyche. He writes that when an insight is genuine, that is, when it corresponds to something real in the deeper layers of the personality, it endures. It becomes a steady point of orientation, something that continues to illuminate life long after the moment of discovery. Illusions do the opposite. They collapse when confronted by the demands of life or by honest self-examination. Sri Aurobindo extends this insight into the spiritual domain. For him, truth is the movement of consciousness towards its own higher and eternal nature. Truth widens and stabilizes the being, giving it firmness and inner breadth, whereas falsehood contracts and disintegrates it. What is true becomes a foundation. What is false cannot bear the weight of existence. Thus, truth reveals itself by its endurance, its ability to remain luminous amid change, and by the way it anchors consciousness in something deeper and more real than the restless movements of the surface mind. Now that we have established the basic principles by which truths in consciousness can actually be judged, we are finally ready to see where the hard determinist position goes wrong. But before we move into that analysis, there is a subtle issue that almost always goes unnoticed and yet it quietly determines the entire debate. And it has to do with the fact that the hard determinist worldview begins by excluding the very evidence that would challenge it. This is not a philosophical mistake, it is an epistemological necessity of the materialist framework. If you begin with the assumption that matter alone is real, then anything suggesting that consciousness might exceed matter must be ruled out in advance. It cannot be entertained, it must be dismissed before the discussion even begins. And this is precisely what we see in practice. Materialists routinely reject anomalous or inconvenient phenomena in consciousness, especially those that challenge the idea that the mind is nothing more than a byproduct of neural machinery. Take, for instance, the example of veridical near-death experiences. These are cases in which individuals who, while in cardiac arrest, with flat EEGs, no cortical responsiveness, and critically reduced blood flow, report accurate descriptions of events occurring around them. Keep in mind, these are not symbolic visions or vague impressions, but precise details that should, in principle, be impossible for a non-functioning brain to generate. Such events are meticulously documented and independently verified by the very empirical standards scientists ordinarily rely upon. Yet, despite meeting those standards, they are dismissed precisely because their implications cannot be accommodated within a strictly materialistic framework. Or consider the cases of terminal lucidity, which is the spontaneous return of clarity, memory, and personality in patients with severe dementia whose brains are, by all medical accounts, incapable of sustaining such cognitive functioning. At the very moment that the brain deteriorates beyond repair, the person reappears with striking coherence. Such cases, along with others involving precognitive dreams and the lasting personality changes reported after NDEs, do not prove anything metaphysical on their own, but they are data. They belong to the observable landscape of consciousness, and for that reason alone, they warrant a genuinely open consideration in any serious inquiry into the nature of consciousness. But the hard determinist cannot allow that, because the moment consciousness is granted even a hint of autonomy from matter, the entire deterministic system collapses. And so, instead of engaging with these phenomena, the epistemic standard quietly shifts. Now evidence must be perfect, the conditions flawless, the interpretations airtight, a standard they never seem to impose on their own favored explanations. This inconsistency reveals the bias. When data appears to support their narrative, an fMRI correlation or a speculative evolutionary story, it is entertained even when it is incomplete or largely inferential. But when any data challenges the framework, even slightly, it is rejected before the conversation even begins. This is not scientific caution, it is metaphysical gatekeeping. And the significance of this cannot be overstated, because it shows that the determinist framework is not merely describing the world, it is policing what counts as evidence in the first place. What these anomalous cases actually suggest is that consciousness possesses a coherence, stability, and independence that the materialist model cannot account for. It presents itself not as something created by the brain, but as something expressed through it, and at times only partially constrained by it. This is precisely what Jung means by the autonomy of the self, and what Vyasa points to when he says that the Atman remains untouched by the movements of nature. The problem, then, is not merely that determinism offers an incomplete picture. It is that it cannot accommodate any picture in which consciousness is more than matter. And once this is recognized, once we can see that consciousness cannot be reduced to the machinery of the lower aspect of Prakṛti, the entire determinist worldview begins to unravel. For if the mind is not fully determined by physical causes, then the human being cannot be dismissed as a mere product of insentient nature. This leads us directly to our next step, evaluating determinism by the very principles we established earlier. First, determinism offers no experiential or transformative power. The truths of consciousness must be lived and realized from within, but determinism gives the individual nothing to work with, no method, no aspiration, and no possibility of inner change. It is a theory without a path. Real truths of consciousness demand engagement, effort, and the reshaping of the self. Determinism requires nothing, changes nothing, and deepens nothing. Second, determinism is not existentially functional. It does not strengthen the individual's capacity to live, it weakens it. The belief that all action is predetermined subtly erodes meaning, responsibility, aspiration, and even the desire for growth. As Jung reminds us, truth is that which helps us live properly, but determinism produces the opposite effect. It diminishes vitality. Third, determinism fails to bring coherence or order. Instead of integrating the psyche, determinism fractures it. One is forced to act as though choices matter while simultaneously believing that they do not, an inner contradiction that breeds confusion and dissonance. A genuine truth must clarify, not obscure. And finally, determinism fails the test of endurance. A worldview that collapses inwardly the moment it is lived cannot be true in consciousness. Determinism may satisfy the intellect for a while, but its psychological effects slowly wear down the inner life. It cannot sustain itself as a lived truth without generating nihilism or resignation. What this reveals is simple, that the determinist worldview fails not only philosophically, but existentially. It does not illuminate the inner life, it impoverishes it, and then mistakes that impoverishment for insight. And this failure leads us to a deeper and unavoidable question. What actually happens to a human being who tries to live without agency? It is here that thinkers like Dostoevsky and Nietzsche become indispensable, because each saw with extraordinary clarity what unfolds inside the psyche when the idea of freedom collapses. And it is no accident that we began our journey with the underground man's desperate cry that he is not a piano key. That line was not just a dramatic opening, it was a preview of the inner disintegration that follows when a human being tries to genuinely live as though he is nothing more than a mechanism among mechanisms. Dostoevsky had already traced the contours of that collapse with terrifying precision. Now we can return to him to see what exactly he was pointing at. In Notes from the Underground, Dostoevsky gives us a man who has taken the deterministic worldview not merely as an intellectual position, but as an existential condition. The underground man looks out upon the same kind of universe that Sapolsky describes, a universe governed by laws, causes, and necessities, where every event is nothing more than the inevitable consequence of what came before. In such a world, 2 times 2 makes 4 is not just arithmetic, it becomes a symbol of absolute rational necessity. It represents a universe in which nothing could ever be otherwise, and in which nothing genuinely originates from within the human being. And what is the underground man's response to this picture? He hates it. He feels insulted by the idea that he could be reduced to a passive outcome of external forces, a mere piano key on which nature plays its pre-written tune. The more he contemplates this, the more it corrodes him from within. Resentment gathers, then burns, then crystallizes into defiance. He fixates on the image of 2 times 2 makes 4, not because it is wrong, but because it represents a universe that is perfectly rational, perfectly intelligible, and perfectly closed. A universe in which no genuine movement of the will is possible, No inner spontaneity can arise, no self can be said to exist in any meaningful sense. In a world reduced to necessity, there is no space for what he feels most intimately within himself, the living subject, the interior center of experience, the being who wills. And so he says, in one of the most psychologically revealing lines in all of literature, that a human being will act against his own best interests, against reason, even against happiness itself, simply to prove that he is not a piano key. When you tell a person that he is nothing more than the passive endpoint of external causes, something deep within him rises in revolt, not in the name of morality, not in the name of religion, not even in the name of logic, but in the name of his own inwardness, the felt fact of being a willing subject. Dostoevsky's insight is devastatingly simple. The psyche cannot live as a machine. It can imitate one for a while, it can pretend, but if this pretense sinks in deeply enough, it does not produce peace or scientific clarity, it produces pathology. This is exactly what we see in the underground man. Outwardly, he accepts the deterministic picture. Inwardly, he cannot bear it. His entire life becomes a kind of twisted protest against it. He sabotages relationships, ruins opportunities, humiliates himself, and inflicts suffering on others. Not because he is irrational in any shallow or dismissive sense, but because his psyche would rather tear itself apart than submit to the belief that he is nothing more than a passive product in a world of objects. Dostoevsky is showing us what happens when the belief you are only a mechanism becomes an existential reality. The result is not enlightened acceptance, it is fragmentation, resentment, and self-torment. The underground man becomes a mirror for the modern individual who tries to live without agency, petty, spiteful, inwardly divided, and perpetually at war with himself. And here we return to the opening line. The man who proves to himself every minute that he is a man and not a piano key is not making a logical argument, he is making an existential one. His whole being is saying, I would rather suffer in contradiction than live as a cog in a perfect machine. Determinism may satisfy the intellect, but it starves the soul. Nietzsche saw, as Dostoevsky did, that a human being cannot live as a mere endpoint of external forces. But his answer was radically different. Instead of revolting in bitterness, he called for self-overcoming, the demand that the human being create his own values, forge his own meaning, and become the architect of his own life. If the old structures of meaning have collapsed, then the only remaining foundation, he claimed, must be the will itself. The task he sets is immense, to affirm existence so completely that even the eternal repetition of one's own life would be embraced. It is heroic, it is magnificent, but psychologically, it hides a quiet impossibility. Because the lived reality of the psyche tells a different story. The ego, as we actually find it in human beings, is not free. It is shaped by instinct, history, trauma, culture, unconscious drives, precisely the forces Nietzsche expects it to transcend. To demand that this limited structure create its own ground of meaning out of nothing is to ask it to become a kind of God, something it simply cannot do. The project asks the ego to lift itself by its own shoulders, a feat conceivable in spirit but impossible in practice. Nietzsche's own life reveals this impossibility with remarkable clarity. In striving to be the sole creator of his values, he placed upon the ego a weight it could not carry. His later writings oscillate between soaring affirmation and a deep solitary strain, as though the very ideal of willing oneself into absolute freedom were exhausting the ground on which it stood. And when he finally broke in 1889, Whatever the medical explanations, the symbolic truth is hard to ignore. A philosophy that asks the ego to generate its own transcendence eventually collapses under the pressure of its own demand. Nietzsche lived his vision so intensely that he exposed its limit from within. So, we arrive at a double insight. Dostoevsky shows us that a human being cannot live as though he has no freedom, while Nietzsche shows that he cannot generate absolute freedom from the ego alone. The first position leads to inward rebellion and self-sabotage, the second to exhaustion and collapse under an impossible ideal. Both, in their own way, reveal the same underlying truth. The human being cannot live without freedom, but the ego by itself cannot provide it. And this brings us to the real heart of the question we have been circling from the very beginning. If the determinist is wrong to deny freedom, and the egoist is wrong to claim it as his personal creation, then where does true agency come from? What is the actual source of our freedom? How can we move beyond the machinery of nature without falling into nihilism on one side or hubris on the other? To answer this, we return to the three thinkers we met earlier, Carl Jung, Vyasa, and Sri Aurobindo, because each of them, in his own way, discovered that the structure of consciousness itself contains the solution. And the most natural place to begin with is Jung, whose distinction between the ego and the deeper self goes straight to the heart of the question of free will. For Jung, the ego, the everyday I we normally identify ourselves as, is not the true center of the psyche. It is a small, fragile island of awareness resting on a vast and largely unconscious foundation. Necessary, yes, but never sovereign. And because the ego is shaped by history, instinct, trauma, and inherited patterns, Jung is very clear. The ego, taken by itself, is not free. But this does not mean that freedom is an illusion. It means that the ego has misunderstood its position. Nowhere is Jung's view stated more explicitly than in his book Aeon, where he reinterprets a medieval theological formula in order to describe, in psychological terms, the fundamental role of consciousness in the process of inner development. He paraphrases the text to say that consciousness was created so that it may 1. Recognize its descent from a higher unity, 2. Show reverence to that source, 3. Serve its commands intelligently and responsibly, and 4. Thereby allow the psyche to achieve the highest degree of life and development. Jung's point is not theological. What he means is this: the ego becomes most itself not when it tries to dominate, but when it aligns with the self. This is why Jung insists the ego has mistaken its post. It imagines itself to be the sovereign agent of our lives, and then it suffers when it discovers its own limitations. Jung's point is not to belittle the ego, but to reposition it. The ego is not the general of the psyche, it is the emissary. It cannot manufacture freedom, but it can participate in a freedom already moving within the deeper self. And the moment this is understood, the entire dialectic shifts. The ego is no longer condemned as an illusion, nor celebrated as an absolute creator. It becomes what it was always meant to be, the conscious collaborator of a will wiser and more coherent than anything it could produce on its own. Freedom, for Jung, is the measure of this collaboration. The more we align with the self, the more our actions arise not from compulsion, but from clarity. And it is this movement from fragmentation to inner cohesion that marks the passage from unconscious determinism to psychological freedom. This distinction between the ego and the self is mirrored with striking clarity in Vyasa's metaphysics. Where Jung speaks of the self and the unconscious, Vyasa speaks of Atman and Prakṛti, but the underlying structure is the same. Prakriti, in its lower and mechanical aspect, is nature governed by the drives, habits, impulses, and patterns of conditioning that shape behavior. At this level, the determinist is entirely correct. The movements of Prakriti follow laws. Actions arise from causes, and the ego, entangled in these processes, is not the true origin of what it claims as my doing. Vyasa captures this distinction in the Gita with a devastatingly clear verse. The gunas of Prakriti perform all action. The self, deluded by the ego, thinks I am the doer. If we stop here, we arrive at the same conclusion as Sapolsky. The feeling of authorship is produced by a complex machinery we do not control. At the level of Prakriti, the determinist is not mistaken. But Vyasa does not stop here. He draws a second, crucial distinction. The modes of nature belong to Prakriti alone. The self is distinct and untouched. The Atman, the deeper self, is not bound by the movements of Prakriti. It witnesses them, it supports them, but it is not defined by them. Determinism applies only to the outer mechanisms, not to the deepest center of our being. And this is where Vyasa performs a move that neither the determinist nor the egoist ever considers. He tells us that Prakriti, the machinery of nature, is deterministic, but only within its own field. The mistake of the determinist is to universalize that field as though the mechanical were the whole of reality. And the mistake of the egoist is to imagine that the ego can somehow rise above Prakriti through sheer assertion. Vyasa dismantles both errors at once by drawing a vertical distinction. The ego belongs to Prakriti and is therefore entangled in its compulsions, but the self does not. The very fact that we feel torn between our better and lesser impulses is itself evidence that something in us does not fully belong to deterministic lower nature. If we were only Prakriti, we would never experience its movements as bondage. The sense of inner contradiction, of wanting to be more than we currently are, is the whisper of the self, the sign that freedom is not something we must invent, but something we must learn to remember. Thus, when the Gita urges Arjuna to surrender to Krishna, it is not demanding blind obedience to an external deity. Psychologically interpreted, it is an instruction to align the ego with the deeper self, to allow consciousness to shift its center of identification away from the machinery of Prakriti and towards the enduring core of being. As this shift takes place, the sense of helpless entanglement begins to loosen. A different kind of agency, calmer, clearer, and less reactive, begins to appear. Sri Aurobindo takes these insights and places them in an evolutionary framework. For him, the human being as we ordinarily find him is largely deterministic because his consciousness is still centered in the outer mental vital ego. But within each of us, he says, there is a psychic being, a soul consciousness, a flame of the divine that is already oriented towards truth and freedom. This psychic being is not a poetic metaphor. It is a concrete fact of inner experience, accessible through sincere introspection, yoga, and spiritual discipline. When Aurobindo writes that the psychic being, if trusted, leads us to the right path, he is describing the same process Jung calls individuation, the gradual recentering of life around the deeper self rather than around the ego. From Aurobindo's perspective, freedom is not a static property we either have or do not have. It is something that increases as consciousness evolves. Sri Aurobindo is unmistakably clear about what this evolution feels like from within. As consciousness begins to shift from the restless surface mind towards the psychic being, one discovers a peculiar experience that is neither the ego's strain nor the determinist's helplessness. It feels like space, like an inner widening in which reactions lose their urgency and choices no longer feel like frantic negotiations but quiet recognitions. Aurobindo describes this as the emergence of a truer will, a will that does not push or grasp but simply knows. And anyone who has tasted even a small movement of this inner shift will recognize it instantly. You feel less dragged, less compelled, less at the mercy of moods and impulses. Your action begins to carry the unmistakable sensation of originating from a deeper poise. This is the experiential signature of freedom as Aurobindo conceives it, not the ego straining to lift itself by its own shoulders, but the being reorganizing around a center that was always free. At this point, the convergences between Jung, Vyasa, and Aurobindo become impossible to ignore. Each of them dismantles the determinist and the egoist from a different angle. Yet all three arrive at the same living truth, that real freedom emerges only when the surface being aligns with the deeper self. And this is why, across Jung, Vyasa, and Aurobindo, a single truth announces itself. Freedom is not escape from necessity, but reordering of our inner hierarchy. The lower parts of our nature obey the laws of the lower world, just as the body obeys gravity and the mind obeys habit. But the higher part of our being responds to a different law, one that speaks not in force but in resonance. When we align with that deeper center, necessity does not disappear. It rearranges itself around meaning. Circumstances remain what they are, but we are no longer flung around by them. Instead, we move through them with a quiet steadiness, as though the ground beneath our feet has changed. This is the paradox all three thinkers converge upon. The more we align with what is deepest in us, the more we feel, not intellectually but experientially, the strange and luminous sensation of being inwardly unbound. You are not a piano key because you are not the instrument. You are the musician. The body, the brain, the gunas of Prakṛti, these are the keys, the strings, the mechanisms. The ego is the temporary performer who imagines it owns the music. But behind all of this stands the deeper self, the real source of initiative, meaning, and direction. Free will is not the ego banging on the keys at random. Free will is the degree to which the true musician can play through the instrument without distortion. And so the practical question of free will is no longer, am I absolutely free or absolutely determined? That question belongs to the abstract mind. It leads only to sterile debates. The real question, the one that matters for your actual life, is this. Right now, in this situation, from which part of myself am I acting? From compulsion or from clarity? From wounded reaction or from genuine conscience? From the restless machinery of Prakṛti or from the quieter voice of the deeper self? To the extent that you can recognize that deeper voice, trust it and act from it, even when it costs you something at the surface, you are exercising real free will. And as you do this repeatedly, something remarkable begins to happen. Your sense of being a passive product of forces fades, and a different sense emerges. A sense of being carried and guided by something within you that is wiser, more stable, and more free than your ordinary mind. In the end, then, the answer to the question, do we have free will, is both simpler and more profound than either the determinist or egoist imagines. At the level of the surface personality, our freedom is limited, conditioned, and often illusory. But at the level of the self, freedom is not something to be created. It is something that already is. Our task is not to invent that freedom, nor to deny it, but to grow into it, to remember, through experience and transformation, that we are not the piano keys desperately trying to prove we exist, but the unseen musician learning, note by note, to play through them more consciously.